It's just drawing so much. It's like 50% already. It's really nice. I mean, it's pretty good. I was going to say 14 out of 100. No, I did that yesterday, but I was close to it.
Okay, let's, I think we're at time here. No, of course, Fitbit. There you go. All right, 11 o'clock. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so obviously today we are going to keep going, right? We're going to keep talking about how we do research in a second here, and I'll review the last couple slides we did last time just to kind of get our heads back in the game and all that fun stuff. Before I do that, though, I guess a couple of things I need to tell you. Okay, so obviously we had no labs this week, as I said on, what day? Tuesday? God, has it been 1,000 years yet, or just one day? The E-class problems yesterday particularly were troublesome, where E-class wouldn't work because nothing works. Okay, so yeah, what was I saying? I don't even remember. Yeah, so basically no labs this week. Obviously Tuesday, Wednesday, we didn't have a lab. Next week, we're going to start into the labs. So you're in either a section, and you'll see it on Bear Tracks. That's on Tuesday from 2 till 4, or Wednesday from 3 until 5. I will definitely be there. We might have a TA, question mark, maybe, for the class. I think there's talk of maybe it might work, perhaps. So it might not be me teaching the labs the whole semester. I think Celine Beaulieu, who's one of our grad students in the department, might be teaching it. But I haven't signed any paperwork, and neither has she, so it might still be me. Who knows? So yeah, that might change a little bit. On E-class now, I think I've got everything pretty much set for exams and for the mini lab and major lab assignments. Basically, I created kind of submission portals for each of the 6 mini labs, and then the 2 major labs with all of the supporting documents for each of the major labs. So it has a description of the lab, the rubric, and a template for an information and consent letter. And yeah, basically, like I said last time, the major labs are basically sort of a research proposal. I'm actually going to see if I can... Oh, something works. Okay. Sorry. I made you move your coffee. Maybe that'll cut the heat a little bit. It's toasty in here. Yeah, so basically they're sort of a research proposal. The first one, the one that's due kind of, I think the 18th of October, is for a quantitative research project. And the second one is due like December 6th and is for a qualitative research project. And don't worry, like as we go through the mini labs, you're gonna be working through all the parts and you can put those all together, improve them from the mini labs, and then kind of go from there. So all of that is now online. So feel free to take a look. The due dates are all there. If you click on the link, it'll show you the due date. And all of the kind of descriptions of what you have to do. And I think all of it is really straightforward. But if you have any questions, do feel free. And the rubrics are there, right? So you can know exactly how you're going to be graded, what each part of the assignments is worth. So as you're kind of working on it, you can be looking at the rubric and be like, okay, what's the expectation on this portion of the assignment, and suit your work, or build your work to suit that, right? So everything already there. I think I'm doing pretty good. Day 2, I've got all of the supporting documents online. I've got the slides that'll be used in the labs, because in the labs, basically, either myself or Celine or someone else We'll be leading you through some activities to kind of get you thinking about, how to do research, how to formulate research questions, all this kind of stuff, so that you can then go and do the mini lab assignments. Those up to, I think, October 18th, the 3 kind of labs that are before kind of that first major lab is due are all there. So you can, you don't have to look at them, but you can if you want to. Okay. Now, I guess I'll jump back into this in a second. But now that you've had a couple of days to sort of think about it, any questions about the course, about the assignments, anything that you want to ask before? And there'll be lots of other chances to ask, but just before we jump back in, is there any kind of questions you think you need to ask, you feel like you need to ask, or anything like that? You're all okay. You're like, you've over-explained everything. Please stop. Just get to it. Okay. If anything comes up, of course, do reach out or come talk to me after class or send me an email or whatever happens. Okay, so we're talking here in kind of this section about basically doing social research and setting up sort of the broad kind of basis, right? Which people bring to, formulating a research question and figuring out what kind of research they want to do, right? So basically last time we ended off talking, we set up some kind of really, really broad categories in terms of social research. And we ended off kind of talking about epistemology, right? Or basically how you think you can gather kind of information or knowledge about the world, right? And basically, kind of how we laid it out is that in social research, there's more or less 3 basic positions that people come from. So positivism, interpretivism, and critical theory or critical approaches. Right, so positivism, just a very quick review, basically kind of takes as its model the natural sciences, right? It wants to learn about the social world by gathering as empirical and sort of objective or intersubjective information as possible, right? So things that can be measured and typically quantified, right? Turned into numbers or statistics are the purview of kind of people who have a positivist epistemology, right? And so you'll see this mostly in quantitative research, right? Where people are, you can see it in qualitative research as well, but less so, right? Where you want, objective kind of facts about the social world in as much as they exist, right? So, you're objectively measuring public opinion or people's ideas about a certain subject or people's experiences through a set of standardizable research tools, right? So surveys and questionnaires are the big ones when we talk about quantitative research. But again, we'll talk about that more as we go. Generally, it's deductive, right? Generally, you have a kind of position, you have a hypothesis, and then you gather the data and try to either prove or disprove your hypothesis, right? It comes from this idea that science and these kind of more empirical ways of gathering evidence are more value-free. That science and scientific statements are relatively value-free. They're a reflection of objective facts or intersubjective facts. All right, so interpretivism, right, is more, it's a critique of positivism, a critique in the sense that it says there's much more to the social world than simply things that can be measured and quantified and turned into numbers, right? You want to measure the subjective meaning of people's lives, right? How people understand their own lives, right? Their own subjective perspectives about what phenomena in their lives mean to them, right? So basically, it comes from the position that we're constantly interpreting reality, right, from a social perspective, and that everything, in a sense, is kind of socially constructed, right? A lot of things that we think of as kind of, just the way things are in society or the meaning of phenomena are actually deeply socially constructed, right? So this could be, things as broad as gender roles, right? The gender roles and the way people kind of view them are, the result of people's interpretation of reality, and that these are fundamentally socially constructed, right? Okay, and yeah, basically, it's trying to get an empathetic understanding of people's view, right? Trying to put the researcher or whoever reads the research once the researcher has put it together into the shoes of the people who live particular experiences to tell them, what do people think about these things that they've experienced. Okay, so that's where we ended off last time. Are we good so far? Okay. Wrong keyboard. I'm like, why isn't that working? Right, because I'm on my laptop. I'm super smart, I swear. Okay. And right, like the big school in sociology, I said, is symbolic interactionism, which we won't dwell on too much here. Oops. Well, something's happening. Don't know. Okay, so critical theories and critical approaches to social science. Again, a critique of positivism in lots of ways. And especially, critical theories, especially in their sort of post-Foucault kind of cultural turn of critical theory views, basically critique positivism for the way it makes truth claims and its claims to objectivity, which just says all of these claims to truth through empiricism and positivism are basically just plays for power, right? And that basically these kinds of statements that hold themselves up as scientific or objective are just ways of particular groups in society to hold power over other people. And so, critical theorists in particular will tend to say, science is not value-free, right? And scientific statements are not value-free, that they proceed from people who have worldviews, who are trying to secure as much power for themselves as possible. And if you've ever read any Foucault, which I strongly recommend against, but if you have, maybe you've taken contemporary social theory or some such thing, and you've had the displeasure of meeting Michel, so things like, Foucault will critique, like in Birth of the Clinic, the way that medical, the doctor, he thinks that the doctor is a particularly sinister figure. The doctor and the claims of medical science are really just power plays and truth claims that are meant to give the doctor kind of a lot of power in society at the expense of everybody else, right? So basically, critical theory often deconstructs kind of the power claims of things like positivism, right? And basically, critical theory, critical research is a bit of a grab bag in terms of its methodological approaches, right? It'll use deductive and inductive approaches. It will use quantitative and qualitative kind of ways of doing research, but its real focus is anti-oppressive practices, and it's political in nature, right? So it really wants to look at these sort of dynamics of, how society is structured along lines that give certain people power, that make them the oppressors, and certain people the victims or the oppressed, right? And this kind of gets spread through, ow, I just burned myself. That's good. I'm gonna put my tea down. I couldn't find my good one with the button that stops me from burning myself like that, so I took this dumb Starbucks cup. It's already fallen apart and spilled tea all over the floor. It's good. So basically, critical theory and critical approaches to social research often focus on, these kinds of dynamics between oppressor and oppressed. I'll get you in 1 second. I'll just finish my thought. They typically want to have a practical application, which is like, how do you put theory into practice? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you go over how it claims that they use objectivity as a play for power? Maybe like an example?
So like the example from, say, Foucault would be that doctors, right, and again, you don't have to believe this is just kind of the way that it's structured, that doctors would, say, make claims about human bodies, right, that were objective, but what ended up happening, I'm trying to think, I'm mixing up now History of Madness and Birth of the Clinic in my brain. So the doctor, right, becomes one of the most powerful figures in society, right? We tend to listen to doctors because we view them as, objective arbiters of knowledge about the human body and about what's good for us. They become these very powerful kind of figures, and they gather onto themselves a lot of prestige, a lot of respect, high social position. But for Foucault, right, there's other ways of understanding human experience and things like, especially like mental illness, right? Mental illness is one that Foucault will point to a lot, and he'll point to the fact that, in prior eras, the person who was mad, right, the madman or insane or whatever, was treated very differently in society, right? They were treated sometimes as knowing things that other people couldn't see because of their madness. I mean, if you're into literature, think of the fool in King Lear, right? I don't know if you've read King Lear, maybe not. I don't know if they still read it in high school. But in Shakespeare, right, the fool always sees things that the king doesn't see, right? Because he's mad, right? And he sees the world a little bit off kilter. And Foucault says that's kind of how we used to treat mental illness. But once the doctor gets in there, the doctor's like, no, what we need to do is we need to put all of these people under my care because they're crazy and I have the tools and the knowledge to help them, right? So the doctor and then we put them in insane institutions and pump them full of drugs and all of these sorts of things. And this has, basically been a way that doctors gained power over an aspect of society, right? They claimed that they had the right knowledge and then they became powerful as a result. Sorry, does that make sense now? Okay. All right. Any other questions? Right, Ed. I forgot. We get to hear about all the ambulances go by. Yeah, I can't believe I'm looking forward to when the weather gets a bit cooler because it's really hot up here. I don't know about back there. Okay. I guess I do want to stress this last point again, that conflict theory always wants to have a practical aspect in terms of wanting to put theoretical positions into practice, specifically in these anti-oppressive kind of ways, right? To break down power structures, essentially. Okay. So, in terms of kind of ontology, okay. So we went from epistemology and now we're in ontology. So what is ontology, right? Basically, ontology is, like, if you go right to the philosophical way of thinking about it, is the study of being, right? Is the study of how the world is. How it came to be the way it is, what is the structure of reality, essentially. And basically, in the social sciences, we have two basic positions ontologically, right? So how do we think the world is? One is the objectivist perspective, right? And the other one is the constructionist perspective. And here I've sort of got it split into, constructionist hard and constructionist soft, right? So there are really, really, really hard versions of constructionist point of views, and then there are much softer ones. And I think the ones you'll tend to find most sort of accepted is the softer ones. Okay, but let's go through them in order before I get out of order, which I tend to do. Okay, so an objectivist perspective is pretty easy to understand. Basically, it says that there is a world out there, right? That is, and that world is objectively there, regardless of any kind of perception, right? And so, social phenomenon, things that are happening out in the world, things that people are doing, relationships between people, they are actually happening and we can measure them. They're not simply, a function of people's minds, right? They are actually happening. There's actually an objective reality that can be measured. Okay. The constructionist perspective, does that make sense? Like real world out there, real social things happening in the world, right? People going to school, people going to work, people having children, people getting married, people getting divorced, all things that we can measure in objective ways, right? People oppressing other people, all this kind of stuff. And then you have the constructionist perspective. In the really, really hard version of constructionism, right, there is no objectively measurable reality, only a set of mental constructions. Okay, so I know that's a really broad and kind of dense, I think, philosophical statement in some ways, right? I've got Nietzsche right there. No facts, only interpretations. Basically, the position of kind of the hard constructionists is that, now I'm going to channel Jacques Derrida, which I don't want to do, but I will. That basically, because there's no kind of God's eye perspective, right? That we can't ever be outside of our own subjective perspectives. Really, all we know about reality is that it's a bunch of mental constructions of the world, right? That it's, your brain sort of constructing the world around you, interpreting things that it encounters, and you have no real way of knowing whether you are actually in a body or whether you are a brain in a jar being, stimulated by electrical impulses, right? Because you have no actual way of measuring the objective outside of your own perspective. And so it could all just, you could honestly be a brain in a jar, right? In some scientific lab run by an alien species, and you could be, getting random or not random electrical impulses, and that would be, you would think it's real, it would feel real, but you would have no way of knowing if it actually is. I mean, I'm trying to think. I had just thought of a different example. The brain in the jar is one. The Matrix. Sorry, I think like the Matrix, right? You would feel like everything. If you've seen the movie, now it's very old, but it's still, I think, decent. Not exactly Shakespeare, but it's Keanu Reeves. He's all right. But yeah, you might be in a computer simulation, right? And receiving signals from a computer because all you have is your kind of mental construction. That might be all there is of the world. It's just, what your brain is perceiving. And therefore, you can't make objective claims about the world because everything is just a construct of your brain and of maybe society. Okay, now this ends up being a very impossible perspective because it ends up being a little bit self-referential, and you can just sort of say, well, there's no way to have any objective meaning, so who the hell knows, right? And you get from like really hard constructionist positions, kind of notions like 2 + 2 could be 5, right? Depending on how we define 2. And then you just go down a rabbit hole of nonsense and impossibility. Okay, the constructionist kind of soft approach, right, is much more, okay, that we'll just assume that we are in the real world, right? Because to not do so ends up putting you into an impossible trap intellectually. But so there's an objective world, there are social things happening, right? There are phenomenon, politics, there are sports, there are religion, economics, and all these things that are in fact social phenomenon. And these things are actually happening. There's an actual real world out there that we can measure, but it ends up being really, really difficult to get an objective look at it because everything is marred by human interpretation, right? And even, at the kind of extreme levels of someone like Jacques Derrida, the French kind of post-structuralist thinker, you would have, kind of the conception of because, everything that you know about the world is constructed through language, right? Language has limitations, right? So, almost I'm assuming most of you are probably native English speakers and you've learned most things in English. English has a particular set of kind of assumptions built into it, right? It has, a history, the words mean certain things, and a lot of people will argue that English constructs reality in a particular way, right? Whereas if you spoke Russian or Chinese, or Mandarin rather, or Arabic, you might construct the world in very different ways. So there's an objective reality, but we can't ever quite access it because everything we do is, marred by human interpretation through the lens of language and our own personal experiences and the time and place that you were born and raised and the ideas that, were imparted to you by society. You're going to see things in a particular way, right? Versus if you took someone from 1945 and brought them into the present, they would likely see things in a slightly different way because they have a different context. And if you took someone from, 1,000 years ago, they would see things in a different way yet because of the social context, right? So there is an objective reality, but we can't fully access it because you're locked into your perspective. You can never escape where, when you were born, what language you speak, and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so this is like really on the abstract level. Are we doing okay? Okay, You're like, please move on to something a little more grounded. And don't worry, the class is not all this. We're just setting the framework. Okay. So, ontological assumptions, right? What you believe about, maybe I shouldn't put things on dark slides on this smartboard. Okay. I will think about that. Ontological assumptions, right? What you think is reality is going to affect, the research questions that you formulate and the way you carry out research. At the end of the day, right, if you're very much, in this kind of objectivist category, you're probably going to tend towards quantitative research, right? That there's a world out there, social, and we can measure it, right? So you're going to use a kind of tool set and a research approach that measures things. Whereas if you're in, I don't know what you'll do if you're in a like hard constructionist approach, probably fall into nihilism. But if you're in a soft constructionist approach, right, you're likely, I think, going to go for a much more interpretivist framework, and one that really is interested in and looking at people's interpretations of their reality, right? Because if you think that, there's an objective world, but really all we can know about it is how people interpret it, you're going to be much more interested in people's interpretations of that social world, right? Okay. And yeah, the way your research is carried out, right, if you're an objectivist, chances are you're going to try to measure stuff, right, because you think there are things that can be measured. So you're going to do, likely something like survey research, right, or you're going to look at survey tools that other people have already deployed and gather that data because you think that there is something objective that was measured that you can then kind of work with and use to test your hypothesis. Whereas if you're an interpretivist, you're probably going to want to go and actually talk to people or observe people in the social world to see how they're kind of thinking about their own lives at the end of the day. So, you might do something more like ethnography, right, where you actually go out and observe. Participant observation, right, where you join into the group either in a like right in there or in a kind of off to the side observing kind of way. And don't worry, we'll get to all of those. Or you might, go do interviews or focus groups and just talk to people and ask them about, their experiences and all that jazz, right? But you're going to come to kind of how, because, your epistemology is different, your ontology is different, you're going to come to, different kinds of questions. Now, one thing I will say, with a lot of, even researchers that I know that are doing stuff at a pretty high level, a lot of this stuff is kind of assumed, right? And people don't often maybe reflect on their epistemology or their ontology in particularly profound ways, right? People just kind of have assumptions that they carry with them into the research process, right? Ways that they think you can get knowledge may not be spelled out. But at the end of the day, right, these are epistemology and ontology are ways people relate to the world, and it will affect the way you do research. So, if you go into research, right, if you, go beyond undergrad into a master's, or even, I guess, an honors degree where you're writing a thesis, or a master's or a PhD, it's a good thing to kind of think, okay, what do I think about the world? How do I think I can gather knowledge about it? And what is the nature of reality? Like, do I think there is an objective world that can be measured, or an objective world, but it's hard to measure because we're always through our own lens, or, I'm a brain in a jar and floating here, goo goo gachoo. Okay, sorry. Okay. One of my many terrible memes that I will insert throughout the course. I also enjoy qualitative research. Okay, so actually koalas are horrifying beings, and they probably would kill you if they could, because they have tiny brains because they eat a plant with no nutritional value. But aside from that, okay, so we have two basic kinds, and I've been talking about this, and using these terms, and I'm sorry, that we have in social research in general, right? So we have quantitative research, and as you've probably gathered from what I've been saying, quantitative, right? The subword quantity, right? It's all about numbers and statistics, right? And analyzing data that can be turned into a numerical value or a quantity, right? So, when you hear someone say that something is quantifiable, it's to say that it's measurable. You can convert it into some kind of number. Usually in social science, it's a statistic or, a straight number value. The most common here, and this is like our number one tool in any kind of social research, is questionnaires and surveys, right? So, big ones like the census and the general social survey that the Canadian government runs through Statistics Canada, or the GSS that's run out of University of Chicago in the US, that's been running since the 70s, or any number of kind of surveys, from the cross-sectional, I just did it once and here are the results, to things that have been running for decades and decades. Okay, so that's quantitative research. And qualitative research, right, is more interested really in the quality of things, but that doesn't tell you as much as quantitative does, but in the subjective, right, in putting into words and non-numeric symbols, our understanding of the world. So it's really interested in people's experiences, right? So when you get into qualitative research in sociology, you're really, and I will trip over these words 100 times because I will say the wrong one and then have to correct myself. So I apologize in advance because they really should have come up with 2 words that didn't start with Q, but there you go. That would have been helpful to me at this moment, but no one asked me. Qualitative research, right, is interested in the subjective, in people's experiences, in people's interpretations of the social world, right? So it really digs into the social. That's really what it does, right? And people, you want to talk to people. You want to hear people's experiences. Now, within this, there can be I don't want to say a billion. There's lots of different ways of doing this. One of the more common ones is interviews or focus groups, right, where you actually sit down and have a conversation with someone. But you can do things like content analysis, right? So you can do, you can look at newspaper articles or things people have written, right? You could go through someone's diary or have someone keep a diary or all sorts. There's like a ton of different ways of doing qualitative research, but the goal is always to get at people's experiences, right? And there's some funky ones like, you can look at art people have produced and try to get their interpretation. There's like photographic ways where like, you have research participants keep like a photo journal of stuff. I don't know. I always think it's like send them off to summer camp and have them take a bunch of pictures. I don't know why that's the one that jumps into my head. But that's, a kind of and then you interpret from the pictures. Archival work, there's a lot of archival work, going through photographs and articles and someone's journals and this kind of stuff that you can do as kind of content analysis. Participant observation, right, where you either, observe people from a distance or get right in there. You want to understand what it's like to be a furry. So you put on a furry suit and you head off to the nearest furry convention or furry gathering. And you participate in the life of the furry, right? So right from, you might just like watch people off the balcony, in a kind of public area, or get right into it and do things with people. And there's gradients in between, which we'll cover in the second part of the course when we talk about qualitative research in more depth. Okay, how are we on that distinction? Because that's like the key distinction for the whole course is quantitative and qualitative research. If you don't get these two, you will be in trouble when you get to the assignments because you will write the wrong kind of research question. You will ask the wrong kind of questions in general. So how are we feeling about that distinction? Good? Okay, perfect. Okay. So one of the big questions, and this I think we see more and more in social research is, I've just done this thing, right, where I broke things down into a binary, right? I got my quantitative and my qualitative, and they are different and distinct and never the twain shall meet. Blood enemies, rivals forever to the death. In reality, right, there's been a lot of work in sociology in the past few years, kind of questioning, like probably the past 2 decades, questioning whether this like neat divide between these categories is really that helpful. And I think what we see, and for me, the best research that I've seen done, and the stuff that I think is really valuable, is the one that blends these two approaches, right? So we'll talk about mixed methodologies, which probably is better referred to as multiple methodologies, but mixed methods is what people tend to use. I have problems with this, but we'll talk about that later too. That basically, we have to question whether these two things are irreconcilable, right? Or whether they are, in a sense, tool sets in gaining understanding of the social world that tell us certain things that are interesting about one aspect of the social world, but end up kind of incomplete. And I think, why people will do, something like one of my favorite studies, and if you've taken youth with me or religion, you'll know about this one, the National Study of Youth and Religion that was done out of University of Notre Dame, right, was a big mixed method studies where they did a whole bunch of survey research, but then, 3,000 surveys of American teenagers, but then followed that up with 300 interviews of teenagers as well, right? Kind of recognizing that each of these has its own place and they each tell us something, right? Like, say you're trying to talk about changes in religion in society, you can measure it, right? And your quantitative side will tell you things like, okay, fewer people are attending religious services on a weekly basis. Fewer people report that religion is very important to them. Fewer people, more people are identifying religiously as nothing in particular. But what it won't tell you is any of the why, right? And so you have to go into qualitative research and actually talk to people and get their understanding of why, they've left religion and become a nun, or N-O-N-E-S, or N-O-N-E, not a N-U-N. Again, someone should have picked a better term, but whatever. So, my position tends to be they're not irreconcilable. They're actually both really valuable tools, and that the best studies tend to be those that put both of them together. Other people have different perspectives, obviously, than mine, and there are certainly people in the hard objectivist camp that are like, this is all, I don't know, wishy-washy. It's nothing but feelings everywhere, and they hate it, and they want nothing to do with it at the end of the day. But yeah, I think you get a richer understanding if you can figure out trends and then figure out the why by actually asking people, what it means to them, why they took certain actions, why they've changed, why certain social patterns have changed in their individual case, rather than just assuming that, measuring it is enough to tell you everything. Now, that said, I love quantitative research, and I use lots of it. But, it doesn't tell the whole story ever. Okay, so what influences social research, right? A whole bunch of things. So we've already talked about, epistemology and ontology, right? Each of those, depending on your positions, are going to affect the kind of research you do, what you think is possible, what you're interested in. So that's there. Practical theory, right? I won't talk a ton about theory, but whether you I guess we kind of opened with it. But if you are kind of coming from a grand theory, right? If you're a conflict theorist or an interactionist or a functionalist or a critical realist, that's going to affect the kind of research you do as well, right? You're going to be interested in different questions. You're going to think that different phenomena mean different things. So that one's pretty obvious. Okay, let's, do I have these on? I know I have values on another slide, but let's jump into values then, because we did theory and ontology and all that. Okay, so values, right? Researchers' values, can be really pivotal and everybody has values, right? There's no person that is value free and doesn't come at, the research they're doing with some set of values, right? And so it can contribute to biasing the researcher. It can, through a bunch of ways, right? Choice of topic, right? So again, if you're a critical you come from a critical theory perspective, right? So you have a sort of Marxian base to your thinking, right? You're going to be particularly attracted, say, to questions of, oppression, right? And power dynamics in society, the powerful versus the weak, right? The oppressor versus the oppressed, right? Because it's built into kind of the basis of conflict theory. Conflict is all about social conflict, right? So if you come from a conflict theory perspective, you're going to be looking for research that has to do with social conflict, right? If your, say values are principally sort of positivist, you're going to be like, well, I want something that can be researched objectively, right? Using empirical tools rather than wishy-washy things like, and I don't actually think interviews are wishy-washy, but I'm channeling the perceived spirit of an empiricist, which is probably not fair to them. But yeah, you might be like, I don't want any wishy-washy interviews. I just want hard facts that I can analyze and run through SPSS or R, and none of this messy talking to people, right? Because people lie, people don't understand the basis of their own experiences and all of that kind of stuff. I just want what's measurable, right? Or from an interpretivist framework, you're going to be really interested in people's interpretations. You might be less interested in kind of quantifiable things. So that's going to cause you to formulate different kinds of questions, right? Because you wouldn't, someone who is, I'll go back to religion. Someone who is, objectivist in their framework is going to be like, okay, what has been the change in religious service attendance or measures of religiosity between 1972 and today, right? That would be something that they would be interested in. Whereas someone who is an interpretivist is like, okay, why are people who have, who identify today as nothing in particular, why do they identify as nothing in particular when it comes to religion, right? So you can see, right, there's a difference there in the sort of basic formulation of a research question, the choice of the topic. They might both be interested in religion, but they're going to be interested in different parts of it. The choice of method, right? Obviously, if you're an objectivist, right, you have a kind of positivist epistemology, you're going to want a methodology that gives you the most empirical and intersubjective, objective kind of results that you can get. If you're an interpretivist, you're going to want to talk to people and get people's social experiences. So you have to figure out the methodology that's best for that. How you design your research project and collect the data, then obviously is going to be different, right? Because if you're an objectivist, you're probably either going to send out the survey, or you're going to use data that's already been gathered by someone else, right? So you're gonna, go and grab the General Social Survey from NORC or the Congressional Election Survey. Oh, who does that one? I don't remember. I'm sorry, Congressional Election Survey. I can't remember who does it, but they're very good. Or, Canada's census data, or all of these kinds of things, right? You're going to get that, already existing information, or you're going to generate new information. If you are, interpretivist, you're probably going to, try to find people that you can interview, that you can interact with in some way. You might want to do, observation of people or ethnography or all of these kinds of things. What I'll say, and I'll say this in advance, and I want to prime the pump here a little bit so that you don't do this. One of the things that we don't do in sociology very much is lab studies, right? We leave that for people who don't know what they're doing, by which I mean psychologists. No, I'm kidding. Sorry. I had to get my dig in at psychology at some point. I will talk about lab research a little bit, when we get to another part of the course. We don't really do lab research in sociology, right? And I won't say much more about it at the moment, but when you're thinking about constructing your research questions, do try to stay away from something that would be like lab-based, right? Because we just don't do it. And why? Well, because as sociologists, part of our kind of epistemological framework is that you want people, what's the best way to learn about the social world is in the social world, not in a lab, right? And so, we don't, and, a lot of the famous kind of sociological studies that were kind of set up almost in a lab scenario, like the, which one? The Stanford prison experiment. I'm sure you've all heard of Stanford. They're all bullshit, right? Because they set the conditions of the test in such a way as to, sorry, I shouldn't use bad, salty language, but I'm tired of talking about the Stanford prison experiment. It's stupid. Um, like, well, what about the Stanford prison experiment? Well, this is dumb. It was set up to get a particular result, and guess what? They got it. You know. Anyway, that's why we don't do lab studies, right? Because you can set the conditions of a lab in such a way often as to achieve the result. And we're more interested in, like, I don't really care what would happen if this bunch of undergrad students were put in a simulation of what prison is like. I'm more interested in, I would want to go into a prison and see what prison is like and talk to actual CIs and inmates, right? Rather than, simulated people. So that I will say that when you're thinking next week, right? Because mini lab 1 is all about constructing a research question. Just make sure you don't structure it as a lab, or an experimental kind of question. Like where you set up an experiment, because ultimately those are not really so, and that's what I'll give you as a comment, is like, this is really sort of an experiment. We don't do experiments in sociology. Try again. Okay, so, sorry, choice of method. And here it is important, right? If we are interested in the social world, we don't want controlled environments, right? We want natural environments, natural kind of social settings. So, you wouldn't be interested in a experimental design. You'd be interested in going to the Star Trek convention and seeing, you're dressed as Spock. Why? Why are you dressed like that? Why is this important to you? What, all these sorts of things. Okay. Yeah, based on, you choose your method, you formulate your research design, like how are you going to actually propose it? It's going to be different based on what you know. Your data is going to look very different, right? If you're interpretivist, and you're interested in the social world, it's unlikely you're going to generate a bunch of numbers, right? Because you're just not doing that kind of research. And if you're kind of quantitative, empiricist, positivist, you're not going to an objectivist, you are going to generate a bunch of numbers, right? Because that's the kind of research you're interested in doing. That's the way you think the world works. How do you analyze that data? Well, if you're, gathering numbers, you're going to probably end up using R. And I know you all just had like acid flashbacks to SOS 210. Maybe you had a great experience. I know we have some great people teaching it, but it's hard for students sometimes. Anyway, I have dark flashbacks of when I took statistics in undergrad too. Don't worry. I didn't do well, but I still made it to a PhD and I'm good. And I've done statistical research, so don't worry. Okay, yeah, so you're gonna have different data, and then the analysis of data is gonna look different, right? Whereas if you have a lot of interviews, you're gonna be reading back your interviews, listening back to them. Probably, oh man, I did a lot of interviews for my PhD project, and I would go for a run and I would put them on my headphones and I would just listen back to my interviews as I ran, I think I heard some of the interviews like 30 times. And trust me, at a certain point, you know them better than you know yourself, and it gets to be a little bit hard. I can still, honestly, some of the interviews I did, and this was a good 7 years ago, I can still find the spot in the interview in about 2 minutes, right? I'm like, when was Bill talking about that? I think it was about timestamp 2354. Oh no, I was off by a minute, right? Because I know them so well. You're going to transcribe. You're going to code things, right? You're going to probably be best friends with something like NVivo and learn how to code interviews, right? But it's going to look very different because you're sorting kind of statements into categories rather than, analyzing numbers. And yeah, the interpretation of data, because the data is very different. You're interested in different questions. The interpretation looks different. And then your conclusions are going to end up being very different because you have different sorts of data. By God, I hate that sun. It's very hot in here. Or up here. Maybe I should stop drinking tea. I don't know. Okay. So, values are important, right? They shape people's biases. They shape how people, see the world. They shape what you might be interested in researching, what you think is important. Now, I mean, one of the things that, and even it can be just worth kind of stating, and I did this in the introduction to my dissertation, was just sort of stating my kind of, position that I was sitting in, right? I was looking at stuff happening in Russia. And so I was, pre-invasion, don't worry. And so, I was just kind of, but I was coming at it from a Western perspective, right? That I am, Canadian, not a native Russian speaker, not raised in Russia, something I learned as an adult. And so, I was coming at it from a particular set of values, right, which were Western kind of democratic, liberal kind of values. And, just to state it explicitly so that you know what your own biases are and how they might be affecting things, right? And how your interpretation might be different than, say, someone living in Moscow. Or, you maybe come from an upper middle class background and you're studying, people who are drug users, right? And so you're coming at it from a different perspective than them. You bring a certain set of values to it, which might influence the way you're reading that. Or maybe you were raised in poverty, right? Maybe you come from poverty and now as a researcher, you're bringing those values in. It's really valuable to sort of state those up front, just to, so you know them. And so anyone who's reading your work knows them as well. That's called reflexivity. Okay, holy moly, it's toasty. All right. Oh, we're almost there. Okay, so 3 basic different positions when it comes to kind of values in research. The first one, this is I think the objectivist and kind of positivist sort of view that research should be value free. Now, I don't, basically that the researcher shouldn't be imposing their values on data because, that's going to skew the data at the end of the day, right? And this, again, I think comes very much from the sense that the natural sciences are value-free. I don't know that that's true, but that basically, the researcher shouldn't be putting their values onto the data. The data should be what it is, and there should be no kind of values. Now, I don't think that's necessarily even possible, right? And I'll tell a story of a friend of mine. So a friend of mine, he basically dentist who went on and did kind of research in biological evolution, right? Like I said, so we're a little bit off in the realm. We're out of social research. We're into the natural sciences. But he was working with, and basically he was working on how teeth develop in, I think, tadpoles or something crazy. But basically, he had a supervisor who had a particular theory, because this was his absolute conviction that this is how they emerged. And when my friend found something different, he basically had to switch supervisors, right? Because this person was imposing their kind of framework and values on the research question. And, when something else was discovered as an objective fact, couldn't deal with it, right? So in the natural sciences, especially, we think things should be value-free so that your perspective isn't influencing the data. Now, when we get into the social sciences, we have that same kind of conceit, right? Because, the people who sort of founded the social sciences and the conceit of the social sciences has always been that we want to replicate, hopefully you remember this from SOS 100, we want to replicate, that success and objectivity that the natural sciences have had about the natural world to the social world. So that idea is that things should be value-free, right? We shouldn't impose our values on things. Now, in practice, I actually don't think this is possible, right? Because everybody has a position. Everybody has their own subjectivity that they are putting onto the research they're doing. But that doesn't mean there aren't people that believe this, right? I just think it's not possible, right? There's always going to be, you're going to slant the data in some way. Okay. The second one, research can't be value-free, right? This is kind of what I'm saying. Because you come from a position, right? You have beliefs, you have values, right? You probably, have looked at some of the major social theories and you have one that's more appealing to you than others, right? Like I'm more of a functionalist. A lot of the people in the department are more conflict theory oriented. But that means right there, I'm bringing with me some assumptions, they're bringing other ones, so it's not value free. But you should be open and explicit about your values and your understanding and your subjective position as you're doing research, right? So in the sense so that whoever when you present your research, whoever is encountering it can be like, oh, I understand where Dr. Broussard is coming from. Like this is his perspective, and he's being open about that. He's not presenting it as objective data. Okay, and then the last one. That researchers should, this is, I think, a much more kind of conflict kind of perspective. that researchers should use their values to direct and interpret their investigations, and that these value commitments are a good thing for researchers to have, right? That you bring certain beliefs and values into the world of research, and that's good. And it should guide you in what you're interested in researching, and what you believe at the end of the day. Okay, sorry, I'm very toasty. How are we doing? Everything good? Good. Checking with all corners of the room. Okay, because I'm like in my own world when I'm lecturing, so I'm sorry. Okay. Not surprisingly, researchers sometimes take sides. And this can be a real problem. So you've seen lots of this. You see this actually all over the place in different fields, right? The researchers sometimes take side. And the most common thing that tends to happen here is either, people have political alignments, right? Where they have certain political beliefs that cause them to sort of slant their research in a particular way. Or more kind of commonly, there's funding attached, right? And the funder, especially if it's like ongoing, the funder can in lots of ways disrupt what people are actually studying, right? So, who gets funded? What kind of strings are attached, right? These are all really good questions. And so, this is why if you read kind of, research articles published in journals, there'll often be a note at the end that this research was funded by, I don't know, like, I can't think of one off the top of my head. Like, if we're doing like the major funding agencies in Canada, be like SSHRC or NSERC or these sorts of things. But, you might have, let me think. Like some of the research out of University of Notre Dame on religion was funded by the McGrath Foundation. And the McGraths are these super rich kind of family from Indiana. And they're super Catholic, so they fund super Catholic research, right? So that might tell you that, this researcher that did this research might have had a bias because they want to write, research that's interesting and helpful to the people funding them, right? You see this a lot in pharmaceuticals, right? Where, some of the research might have been funded by Pfizer or by GlaxoSmithKline or one of the big pharmaceutical companies. And sometimes this means that, researchers, in order to continue getting funding, will not report certain things, or, were there strings attached to the initial kind of funding in the first place? So governments too, right? So SSHRC, NSERC, and other kind of government funding agencies. There's an equivalent one in the US. I can't remember what it's called for social sciences. Sometimes fund research that benefits them politically, right? If they want to make certain points or have research that, supports their particular economic policies, they might fund, you see this a little bit in Alberta, for instance, that the government might choose to fund research by very conservative economists, right? That would tend to, support, for all of that, except for the 4 years where we had an NDP government. But for the rest of the time, it's like they want to fund, economists that are going to say, yes, the kind of supply side economics that conservative governments have tended to undertake, that actually is the way that you generate growth and economic potential, right? Whereas, a more left-wing government might take a more either Keynesian or I'm trying to think. The Keynesian is probably the one, maybe even a slightly Marxist perspective, and fund, economists that are going to give them that, right? Because it's going to support their policies, and they can point to, this research study that was done by, Trevor Taze at the University of Calgary. And it supports, this particular policy that the government said. But was there a quid pro quo? Okay, write the kind of research that we want you to write, come to the conclusions we want you to come, and, maybe we'll find a way to keep funding you or, bring you in as a consultant or any of these sorts of things, right? And a lot of times we don't know what's going on behind that because people aren't always transparent when they're being corrupt and dishonest, I think would be the terms I want to use, but maybe that's wrong. So funding can matter, right? People will often bias their findings toward, even Like right now, my boss, and I'm sure she's very ethical, don't worry. But she just got a big agreement with Alberta Justice to go into the prisons and do research with incarcerated people. But, you know, will she write her, and who knows, will she write, she had to negotiate with Alberta Justice, so she had to talk to Conservative ministers. And so she's very careful in how she speaks, but she might also not write things that are super negative about the justice system simply to continue getting access. And I'm not saying that's what she did, but it's always a chance, right? No, don't worry, Sandra's great. Okay, so the wrath of gatekeepers. Yes. One of the things that ends up often being a big problem in research, right? And it can be related to politics, is gatekeepers, right? Basically, you know, one of the things that you're always going to have to kind of contend with when you are doing social research, and especially if you're, I think more when you're doing qualitative research, right, where you want access to particular people and locations, is that you have to somehow get by the gatekeepers, right? Now, in the case of the project I'm just mentioning, right, so this is a huge 8-year research project, tons of funding, going into prisons, you know, talking to in courts, police, prisons, and the reentry system. One of the things that you have to think about is who are the gatekeepers, right? So my boss had to negotiate with Alberta Justice, right? She had to negotiate with the Minister of Justice. And she has to then negotiate with prison wardens individually for the different prisons in Alberta. These are gatekeepers, right? Because you can come up with the greatest research project in the world, right? You can be like, I'm super interested in studying prisons in Canada, and you come up with a great research proposal, and you walk up to the prison and they turn you away and you end up with nothing because the gatekeeper said, nah, I'm not interested in having you come into my prison and talk to incarcerated people, right? As I'm maybe afraid that will make you look bad. And so, these gatekeepers have to be appeased. How do you get access, right? Are there strings attached? These are often things that are not stated, but a researcher very often will write things in a certain way and report data in a certain way, not just so that they get access, but so that they can continue having access later, right? And there are certain parts of kind of the social world that often are very gate kept, and they don't necessarily want to let people in to do studies of things. And so, if you do get access, they're going to want to know that you are going to present things in a way that's favorable to them. This is one reason that studying kind of the movie industry and the TV industry has been so difficult, right? So this is one of the fields I worked in. And one of the things that has tended to be true is, studios and directors and all these people don't want to let researchers in unless they have a really solid sense of how that researcher is going to present things, because they don't want to be made to look bad. Okay. So yeah, you can, be like, I'm going to study this. Getting access is a different story. And sometimes I'll give you an example from my research, right? So I interviewed a guy, Michael Montgomery, British TV producer who had worked in the Russian TV industry. And we had a great interview. But one of his conditions, he's like, I'll talk to you, but once you have your quotes that you think, I want you to compile the quotes that you're going to use in your research, and I want a chance to edit them, right? Because he wanted to make sure that if I presented something he said, it was going to put him in a good light, right? It wasn't going to, and so I did, this was our agreement. I gathered together the quotes and sent them to him. And, there was a couple that he was like, you can't use this one at all. He's like, I don't like how I said this. Some that he just edited. A lot that he just took profanity out of because he swore a lot, right? Because he's British and they just swear, it's crazy. But yeah, this was a string attached to my own research, right? Because he didn't want something to be written in a journal article, which might then get turned into a book, which would then, someone might read it, and be like, oh, that Mike Montgomery guy is a jerk. I'm not going to give him a job. Or he's got a big mouth and he spills the beans about insider stuff, right? So he wanted a chance to edit stuff. And he did. And it was our agreement That was one of the strings attached that I had to kind of deal with, because he was dealing with the politics of his own industry, right? And he didn't want to be put in a bad light. Okay, and yeah, I mean, research findings. What sorts of findings are acceptable to those who fund or publish research, right? So, it's a little bit better now because a lot of the gatekeepers in academic research have faded a little bit in their power, right? But at, say, the big academic journals in certain fields, there are definitely things that they will not publish, right? And stuff gets turned away all the time because their perception is that the researcher has an agenda, or the researcher's findings don't, heterodox research can often be really difficult to publish because sometimes, right, like your research might contradict the existing consensus, right? And so then you have to get it through kind of the journal editor, right, who's going to read your piece and then either decide to pass it on to reviewers. And he might, the journal editor might be like, nah, this is too, heterodox, and therefore, I'm not going to publish this. I'm not even going to send it to reviewers because I know they're going to crap all over it and it's a waste of everybody's time. Or, going to, because we have ostensibly blind review. Half the time who's reviewing your pieces because fields are really small, but ostensibly it's blind review. But yeah, like you have sort of blind review of articles, right? And you send it, and the reviewers may not find it acceptable what you have to say if you're outside of the consensus or outside of their beliefs. So sometimes people will tailor the way they write findings in such a way as to not upset the consensus. And there's been some really prominent examples where someone wrote something that was very much kind of heterodox, and it created a big stir, and they had a lot of kind of problems. I think here of a guy named, I think he's at University of Texas, Austin, Mark Rigneris, and he did it was a big national study in the US, family formation survey, I can't remember what it was called. And one of the papers that he published out of it was basically a paper that said that the children of people who had a same-sex partner had a bunch of social problems in adulthood, right? And it was really well backed up by the data that was in this particular study, and people got really mad. It actually made it through peer review. People got really mad and tried to get it pulled from the journal. The journal temporarily pulled it and then ended up republishing it after they did a second round of peer review to check that he'd done the math correctly, right? So there are politics, right? He was saying something that was not popular in the academy, and he got into a lot of trouble about it. And, people tried to get him fired. They went to the president of University of Texas at Austin and tried to get his tenure revoked and all sorts of things, right? So politics can play a role. What sort of things are acceptable to publish? And is there going to be a backlash? These can be kind of big stories in and of themselves. Okay, sorry, how are we doing? What's the time? 12:07. That clock is fast. Okay, do not rely on that clock. I will make a note. Okay. And this will be pertinent for your lab next week. Okay. So writing a research question is really, really hard. Writing a research question is easy. Writing a good research question is hard. Okay, so what does a good research question look like? As clear as possible and understandable to others. So typically what you want is, for a bunch of reasons, right? If you go into academia, you might want funding, right? So you might want to get into an MA or PhD program, or you might be applying to a funding agency. You cannot always guarantee that, even though we're all very smart people in the academy, except those that aren't, that people are going to understand your particular topic, right? Especially if you start using a lot of jargon. So a good research question should be clear and understandable so that even a layman could kind of understand what you're looking for. I know this probably seems obvious, but it should be researchable. And it should be researchable within a reasonable time frame. Hopefully the time frame that you are suggesting. Now, this actually is really important as well, because often what people do is they propose a question whose scope is so large that the question itself becomes impossible to kind of research. And I remember a friend of mine, when I was doing my PhD, he was doing his master's. His name was Dave, very nice guy. Very capacious mind, like really understood a lot of philosophy and stuff. But when he constructed his research question, he was like basically interrogating the entire Western tradition of philosophy through the lens of the Anthropocene. And you don't understand what I'm talking about anymore. And no one did either. And for some reason, somebody let him start this project. And about year 4 of his master's, he ran out of money and disappeared. Why? Because the question itself wasn't researchable, right? Like it was so broad in scope that it would have been a life's work. But there's lots of times where people will propose, research projects that are, I want to, and there's a couple ways this can go. A, you're never going to get access, or B, the scope of it is too big, right? So I want to, research young people in Canada, and how they use social media in their, actually that's maybe researchable. See, I'm trying to come up with an example off the top of my head. Or, I want to look at youth all over the world, right, globally, and see how they use social media. That question is clearly not researchable, right? Because it's like, okay, where would you go to get the world's youth, right? It would just be too broad of an attempt, right? You'd have to focus it down on, say, hey, let's say, how do youth in Alberta, use social media? Because then you could, theoretically access youth in Alberta, right? So the other way that things can be non-researchable is if there's a gatekeeper in the way and they're not going to give you access. And I see this sometimes. Sorry, I shouldn't tell stories about past students, but I remember having this argument with a student because they got a bad grade on their assignment because I was like, yeah, this is not researchable, and they didn't listen. And they then presented it on their major lab, which I've told you, if I tell you something doesn't work at one level, don't keep going with it, because I will then be like, I told you this didn't work. But basically they were like, yeah, I'm going to get the back-end data from social media companies, right? So I'm going to get all of the data on Instagram users. And I'm like, well, Instagram's never going to give you that data, right? Like Instagram is not a Sherry type of organization, right? Or if you're saying you're going to investigate, you want to do a ethnography of the Hells Angels, or a gang, right? How are you going to get into it? Is that researchable without you getting shot? Or some such thing, right? You're going to do a study of a major Hollywood studio. Well, they're not going to let you in. So what are you going to do, right? It's not researchable because there's no way you're going to get access, right? Especially when we talk about highly privileged spaces, a lot of questions that people have might not actually be researchable because they're assuming they can get access and they can't, right? It's going to be kind of impossible at the end of the day. Relate. Yeah, your research question, obviously, this is a dumb statement, but it's true. And sometimes people do make this mistake, right? The research question doesn't actually relate to what they want to do in the research. That's pretty rare. But make sure your research question is actually asking a question about, what you want to research. So if what you're really interested in is, religious disaffiliation, your research question can't be asking about, how often people pray and what it means, right? Because you're really interested in, and say your research method is tuned to looking at people who stopped doing it and stopped attending religious services, there would be a mismatch. So your research question is going to have to be related to the project you're doing, but that's pretty obvious. And yeah, neither too broad nor too narrow. I talked about the broad already, right? Where if you take too big of a topic, or your thing starts with through all of human history, you've lost the plot. Or I don't know, Canadian society, too big, right off, too big. What part of Canadian society? But also not too narrow, right? You don't want it to be. And here I'll poop on one of my least favorite research approaches, which is autoethnography, which I think is dumb. Where it's like, I did an ethnography or a study of me, which I just think is a stupid research method. But I have my own biases, so you can do an autoethnography if you like, but it's dumb. Sorry. I've had this debate with people who did autoethnographies, and I'm like, are you really that interesting? And apparently they thought they were. I didn't think so, but whatever. Yeah, so that, I mean, or like if you're like, I'm going to research my friend group. Maybe not big enough. Maybe you need to broaden out a little bit, right? Without going too big, right? Or like, I don't know, there could certainly be, say, if you wanted to do a particular, say, group or religious congregation or social club or something, you could do that. But there's always the danger that, then your research findings might not be interesting outside of people who are interested in that one particular thing, right? So a good research question should give you a broad enough field that you can say something that's going to be interesting, but not so broad that you're like, all of Western history, or you know what I mean, right? Like, or all of Canadian society, or everyone, let's back off of really broad research questions. Okay, how's that? I've got like 6 minutes left, but I sense maybe we're petering out a little bit. How are you? You just want to stop? We can stop. We can finish this on Tuesday. Okay, let's stop and you can finish on Tuesday. I just needed to get through enough so that I know on Tuesday you know what a research question is. Because you have a lab where you're going to have to write one. So we'll finish this up. So I think I've just got a few slides left here. We'll finish these up on Tuesday, and then we'll move to our next topic from there. Okay, see you on Tuesday.